I left. I guess some would say I was a coward, but I wasn't. I would have stayed if I had something to stay for. I was a faithful husband and loving father who lived his life for his family, and I was too disgusted to stay. My wife had another man on the side. My kids were in college, my parents were dead, and I was single. I decided it was time to start the next phase of my life, and I was leaving. Here is the story of my departure. Day 1, Sunday. Shortly after sunrise, I pulled on the dock ropes and headed out into the bay. Like most boatyards, my lines were my own, and I would need them when I got to my destination. They were another item on the short list of things I owned that I didn't want to give up. I had already given up too much already. For the past 3 years, I'd kept my boat in a marina north of Annapolis on Whitehall Bay. The Chesapeake Bay has been my home for most of my life, and Whitehall suited me just fine. It was a little cheaper than the marinas in Annapolis, and I never needed the social life in the city. It was a 36-foot boat designed for cruising, called the Voyager, and it suited me in every way. I had bought it in hopes that someday, when I retired, I would cruise the coast and who knows where else. But right now, it was the vehicle that carried me to a new life. I had been a sailor since childhood, sailing with my father and brothers on the water around Annapolis. I raised my children on boats, and both of them became very capable sailors. They are away at college now, but I looked forward to the day when we would sail together again. My wife, Sheila, had never been involved in sailing. When we got a big boat, she started sailing with us. But for her, it was more about seeing, tanning, and looking at all the expensive boats. Looking back, I realized how these two realities defined my life and marriage to Sheila. It seemed like it was always about impressing others, and no matter what she had, she always wanted more. Now I realized I couldn't live that way. Whether we grew apart or never grew together, our marriage had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Most of my traveling was limited to day trips with family and friends. I had a large group of friends who either sailed or wanted to sail, and there was always someone who wanted to get out on the water on Saturday. We would leave the problems and worries of life behind, and for a few hours we had nothing to think about but the wind, the waves, and the markers. Markers are buoys and pilings that mark the channel in shallow water where an inexperienced sailor will soon run aground. They guide you and keep you safe in deep water. The Chesapeake Bay is famous for sandbars and harbor entrances that cannot be called straight, but going aground on sand or mud is more inconvenient than dangerous. It's rare to break here, and after enduring a few friendly nudges from passing boats, you'll soon find yourself in shallow water and back in navigable water. Depth gauges help, modern GPS is great, but a little common sense doesn't hurt. Although I was mostly limited to day sailing, I did manage to do a few weekend cruises and the very occasional week-long bay cruise. Sometimes I had company, sometimes I didn't. But I rigged the boat with a compass auto helm and secured the halyards aft to the cabin roof. One of the simple, but in my opinion, extremely important additions last year was a lifeline that ran down the center line of the boat from the bow of the mast to the transom. It could be secured in a flash, and I bought 2 harnesses to wear in bad weather. If I was going to sail long distances alone, I needed the assurance that I would stay on the boat no matter what happened. Knowing that I was in for the longest swim of my life, I secured the safety line and put on the harness before leaving the harbor. The line on the harness allowed me to move from bow to stern and go underwater if necessary, but it gave me great peace of mind. A sailor begins to think of the boat as an extension of himself, but the boat can actually become independent, and this is especially true when it is equipped for long-distance sailing. No matter what happened, Voyager and I went the distance together. I left Whitehall Bay and headed for the main channel, turning north one last time to pass under the Bay Bridge. The funny thing is that the Bay Bridge is now made up of 2 bridges, but all the locals still call it the Bay Bridge, so as not to confuse it with the bridge tunnel at the mouth of the bay. I avoided the main channel because I wanted to avoid shipping in and out of Baltimore, so I set a course north along the west side of the bay. As I sailed, I pondered. Less than a month ago, I was a husband and father. I was content. How had my life turned to shit so quickly, and were there signs I had missed? Had I done something wrong to deserve betrayal? I was sure I hadn't. I wasn't perfect, but no one is perfect. Had I been uncooperative? Hell yes, I was. Should I stay and fight? If I had stayed, what would I have fought for? Was cheating on my wife worth fighting for? And if I had won, what had I won? Did I want to keep the cheating wife? Would I be able to live like that? Could I trust her again? Was she even the woman I married in the first place? A person changes over the years, and a couple should grow together. How had we gotten so far apart? I didn't have answers, but I had time to think about these questions. And maybe by the time I reached my destination, I would have the answers I needed. I passed the entrance to Baltimore Harbor and turned northeast. I was still tacking across the bay, working upwind, but after passing Baltimore there was less shipping traffic, and I felt free to cross the bay, tacking northeast. North of Baltimore, the bay narrows, and with a good breeze, Voyager crossed it easily. This meant staying on the bow and staying alert. By the time I reached the entrance to Back Creek Channel, it was past noon. This is where my sailing on the first day would likely end, so I lowered and retracted the sails. You don't sail the sea and decannel, and my limited experience tells me that there is never any wind on the Delaware River. You have to be on your guard in the canal because you can run into some very large vessels. On this day I was lucky, and the canal was virtually clear. It was just me and another vessel headed for the Delaware, and one small vessel going to the Chesapeake. It was an easy crossing, and soon I was in the Delaware River heading southeast. I was now in new territory. I had sailed to the mouth of the Chesapeake and up to the head of the bay, but never entered the Delaware. The traffic was heavier, but I stayed out of the shipping channel, and by nightfall had rounded Cape May and reached Stone Harbor at the southern tip of the New Jersey coast. It was the first of many long days, and I was in no mood for company, but I reached the Atlantic. I anchored in a secluded cove and settled in for the night. I had a growing list of questions and no sensible answers, but I had time to think and enough to do to sleep at night. Day 2, Monday. I secured my harness to the lifeline and left Stone Harbor before dawn. I had a feeling it was going to be a rough day, and I wanted to be ready for it. I had lived most of my life in sheltered waters, but this morning I was heading out into the unknown, and I was alone. The wind was moderate and steady out of the east, and the sea was higher than in the Chesapeake, so I decided to put a Genoa in addition to the mainsail and jib. The extra power would help us get over the waves, and the wind wasn't too strong to carry an extra sail. I should probably explain something now. The two sails on a cutter are more properly called a yank and a jib, but I grew up on slups with small jibs and large Genoa. I never got rid of the language of my youth, so I referred to Voyager sails as staysail and Genoa. Everyone seems to know what I mean. As I headed northeast along the New Jersey shore, I also checked the weather forecast. A tropical depression was approaching from the south, but it was still 24 hours away, and I had time to enter the sheltered harbor this evening. The Jersey coast is famous for having too few good harbors where a sailor can take shelter during a storm, so I listened to the Weather Channel on the radio. I had an inexpensive solar panel that I could mount on the cabin roof that produced enough power to run the radio and could charge the engine battery if the generator went dead. The Voyager had a small diesel engine, and so far it had been perfectly reliable. But when you're at sea, you want to keep your options open. Sailors of the old square-rigged ships were always wary of approaching the leeward shore during a storm, so I kept an eye on the nearest harbors both ahead and behind in case I needed shelter immediately. Voyager's windward course took her over the crests of the waves and through the troughs. As the wind picked up, the spray got stronger and stronger until it was time to build a lone sailor's shelter, and I set up a dodger that gave me the protection I needed. At this time of year, the water in the Atlantic is still cold, and the wind can chill you to the bone, so I opted for either a dodger or bad weather clothing. With the dodger up, I could enjoy the warmth of the sun, so it was an easy decision. Voyager was enjoying the wind in sea. I was sailing at a good pace, and with minimal attention, the boat handled the sails on its own. As Voyager got into a rhythm and nothing else distracted me, my thoughts went back to that first horrible night. Sheila and I were cooking one of my favorite meals together. I was grilling the skirt steak we'd marinated overnight, and the whole potatoes were wrapped in foil and lying on the hot coals to bake. She made us a great Caesar salad and braised carrots with honey. This is exactly how I always envisioned our free years. We would pamper ourselves and devote time to each other, but it wasn't meant to be. After dinner, after putting away the dishes and grill, we sat on the back porch sipping drinks, and it felt like the warmest evening of the early summer season. It was then that life as I knew it came to an end. Bill, you know I love you, don't you? Of course I do. We had spent half our lives and most of our adult years together, building careers and raising 2 children. And now it was our time. I looked at her and was puzzled by the expression on her face. Was it fear? Honey, what's bothering you? She turned away for a moment and looked into her glass. Bill, I've met someone I'm interested in. 25 years of marriage accustomed a man to think one way and not the other. Why don't you invite them over to our house? I'd like to meet them too. That's not that kind of relationship. Now I was confused. What do you mean, not that kind of relationship? What kind of relationship is it? She didn't answer my question directly. I want to get to know him better. Sounds good to me. Like I said, why not take him out to dinner sometime? The expression on my wife's face went from frightened to determined, almost angry. She took a deep breath and said, Bill, I'm going to have an affair with him. It won't affect us. I'll still be around you almost as much as I am now. As I sat on the Soul of Voyager's cockpit reliving that moment, it occurred to me that I had no memory of what happened next. I had read about the fugue state, but I don't think I ever understood it. When I came out of it, Sheila was yelling at me. Bill, damn it, are you listening to me? I shook my head and reconnected to the world. I muttered, Yes, I'm listening. Well, what are you thinking? What do I think about what? Damn it, Bill. What do you think about what I told you? I stiffened and muttered. You told me you wanted to have an affair. Now she was annoyed. I told you I wanted to be alone. The kids are grown and I need some personal time to recharge my batteries. I wondered if I should say, and where exactly do you plug the charging cord into? But found no point. What's his name? I could feel the anger building up inside me. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know, I shouted. What's his name, bitch? I'd never raised my voice at her in all the years we'd known each other. And in that moment, I wondered if that was a mistake. She recoiled, and for a moment I saw a look of fear on her face. But it passed. If you're going to talk to me like that, I'm going to my room. You can sleep in the guest room tonight. I thought, well, bitch, it's our room, not yours. But right now I wouldn't sleep in the same bed with you if my life depended on it. Mentally I screamed, but used all my discipline to keep quiet. After that, I sat on the back porch for hours and finally went to the guest room. But I never fell asleep. I was up and out before the alarm clock even rang. The movement of the boat brought me out of my reverie. The boat had slowed down and seemed unsteady. She was struggling. I looked up at the roof. The wind had veered to the southeast and I decided to change course. If the wind blows the sails to sideways, they can deflate like airplane wings. Then the boat would experience difficulties, and the graceful movement of the hull through the water would cease. In any case, it was time to move further east, or I was approaching the shore. We turned east, and I reset the auto-helm, but the wind was increasing, so I went ahead and pulled up the jib. The boat then settled into a comfortable motion, with minimal mainsail and Genoa trim. If the wind increased even more, I would have had to furling the Genoa and raising the jib. I sipped from a glass of iced tea, my favorite beverage when sailing, and sank into my thoughts. That day, after Sheila had dropped the bomb on me, I tried to work, but I was failing miserably. She said she was going to have an affair. What kind of wife tells her husband she's going to have an affair if she hasn't given him a test drive yet? She was already taking time away from us to be with him. I've known Sheila too long to think she didn't do it with this guy before telling me. She didn't ask permission. She was notifying me that she was developing an affair. I lost control of my composure, grabbed my coffee cup and hurled it at the wall of my office. At that moment, my secretary walked through the door. "Bill, are you okay? What happened?" She saw the hole in the wall and the coffee splattered everywhere. "Yeah, I'm fine." She looked at the wall again. "It's not okay. What's going on?" Carol had lived with me for over a dozen years. She was about my age and had previously been married to a potential player who couldn't keep it in his pants. If anyone could understand what I was going through, it was her. I asked her to close the door and sit down. Then I laid it all out. Carol was shocked, but at the same time she was much more sensible than I was. "Bill, it sounds like she started the conversation but never finished it." I rolled my eyes and started to speak, but she stopped me. "Bill, you need to listen to the story to the end. Maybe she was just thinking out loud or sensing you. You need to find out for yourself exactly what she intended to do. She wasn't wrong, but the thought of having to go back and finish this conversation made my stomach churn. Bill, are you okay? You look a little green." I took a deep breath to calm my mind and then my stomach. "I think I'm fine. I just can't believe she's doing this." Carol thought for a moment. She was the perfect assistant. There were aspects of my job that only I could do, but so many things I did poorly. Carol was always 3 steps ahead of me when I needed it. You need to gather your thoughts and prepare. Make a list of possible intentions Sheila might have. List them from least to most offensive. Then for each possibility, decide how you want to proceed. You can always change your mind, but it will help guide you to know what your options are. Sometimes I felt like Carol missed her calling. She could have been a great non-judgmental therapist. I nodded and she excused herself briefly, then returned with a fresh cup of coffee. "Try not to give up on this one." She smiled and her smile was infectious. For the first time, I felt like someone was on my side. I spent the rest of that day working on my list. Carol must have distracted everyone who tried to look in on me, because it's rare that someone doesn't come to me for instructions. I wrote, crossed off, then started again. Eventually, I decided to put things in order, opened up a spreadsheet on my computer, and started making my list. As I pondered, typing, organizing, editing, rearranging, I explored my options. Somehow the keyboard calmed my mind, and the emotions that had overwhelmed me subsided. My rational mind took control. The longer I thought and the more I typed, the clearer my thoughts became. I had options. I would not become a cuckold. If she thought our intimate life was in the past, then I could leave it in the past more completely than she expected. The time had come and there was no putting it off. Carol stayed late in case I needed her, and as I was leaving, she said, "Bill, when you get home, turn on the recording app on your phone and record this conversation. You might want to replay it later." Like I said, she was always 3 steps ahead of me when I needed her. I left work at the office for the first time since I could remember and drove home. All I had was my list, and the knowledge that I wasn't going to be a damn victim in this case. Sheila had obviously already made her decision, but I had options too. Pulling up to the house, I took a deep breath. My thoughts had been organized, and now I needed to get my emotions under control. I would approach this like any other problem at work. I would be rational, calm, and thoughtful, and then once I had all the information, I would make a decision. This went on for about 15 minutes, if not more. She was waiting for me in the living room. I walked in, sank into the chair with my notes, and waited. "Are you done with your little tantrum?" "Damn bitch in hell," I thought. "Can we talk about this rationally without you yelling and threatening?" Very calmly, or as calmly as I could manage, I said in a monotone voice, "I have never threatened you in my life. I would appreciate it if you would acknowledge that fact before we begin." She looked flustered and changed tactics. "Bill, you know I love you. Look at the life we've built together. We have a beautiful home. We're comfortable. The kids are grown and in college. And you have to admit that I've been a good wife to you. It's time. I need the freedom to explore new horizons." "New horizons? You mean new entertainment for Sheila," thought I. My mind was screaming, but I kept my mouth shut. It was at this point that I needed to know what she was going to do. She looked a little hurt that I didn't agree with her. "Like I said, I've been a good wife to you, but now I want a little thrill in my life." She lowered her gaze for a moment, then looked up. "I've met someone. You don't need to know who he is. I intend to work things out with him. I'm not in love. I just want to experience the thrill of familiarity and new experiences. That last statement took all my self-control. So you're going to have an affair, right? Yes, Bill. And that affair has already begun. The question seemed to catch her off guard, but I couldn't figure out why. It was an obvious question that she should have anticipated. Then I saw the determination on her face. No, I wouldn't do that to you. She was lying. I could see it in her face. So what exactly did you do to this man? She was flustered. I guess she was expecting me to freak out before the conversation got that far. I reminded myself to thank Carol for her cool head and planning skills. A few lunches, a few dinners, and once we went dancing, that's about it. Well, I don't remember us being out of town, so I assumed the dinners and dancers had something to do with those late nights when you were working. She had the decency to blush, but she didn't say anything. So you're already lying to me. It's just a matter of degree. That seemed to piss her off, but she still didn't say anything. I could see the challenge building up in her face. So how exactly do you see it working? She seemed to gather herself, and then continued with what I thought was a prepared script. Well, we thought it would continue as before. We did? Yes, Jor. I mean me and my friend. So you and George planned this together? It sounds a lot like an affair to me. She was starting to get angry, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't care. She started repeating herself, which was a sure sign that she was working from a script, and I wondered who had written the script. We thought things would continue as they were. Maybe sometimes I'll come home a little later than usual. I looked at her intently. Say the words, Sheila. She tried to feign embarrassment, but she knew exactly what I was talking about. What words? You're probably coming home a little later than usual because you'll be at his house and you want to take your time having fun with him. At least she had the decency to blush again. I guess. Okay, I get it. What else? Again, she hadn't expected me to move her script forward so quickly. Isn't I think we'd like to get away for a weekend once in a while? It won't be very often, and we won't go somewhere where anyone will recognize us. No one we know will bother you. I thought about what the best-laid plans were and laughed at my own joke. What's so funny? I shook my head. Nothing. Are you still trying to convince me that you haven't had sex with this George guy yet? She didn't answer anything, but at least she didn't repeat her lie. I've been working on the list Carol made me prepare. She wants an affair. Bingo. She went out with him behind my back. Check. She lied to me. Check. She's already having sex with this guy. Big check. And she wants to start going away with him for the weekend. That got me to the bottom of the list. The only option I had was divorce. Game over. Let me give you a little gift, Sheila. I want you to pack a bag and go to his place tonight. Spend a few days with him and then we can talk again when we've both calmed down. But I want to stay here and work this out with you, Bill. I'm still your wife and always will be. I looked at her and imagined my hands around her throat as I squeezed the life out of her. No. You want to leave tonight and spend a few days with your boyfriend. If you don't leave, I don't know what I'm going to do. The fear in her eyes was palpable now. I guess she finally realized the anger that was boiling up inside me. I looked at her, and I know my eyes narrowed. In a monotone voice, using the last remnants of my self-control, I said, "When you take away a man's self-respect, you take away his control over his emotions. You shouldn't be here tonight, Sheila. You're not safe." I didn't need to tell her twice. She went to her room, and 10 minutes later she left the house with a small suitcase and left. I was as fit as a fiddle and just sat in my chair until the sun went down. The boat slowed down and the sails began to fan out. This movement brought me out of my reverie. The wind had retreated to the east. The foresail was still furled to port and the mainsail was being stretched. Sails are a means of propulsion, and when they go backwards, it's like going off course. The boat slows down and the auto-helmsman loses control. Once the boat stops responding to the helmsman's actions, the back sails veer the boat off the correct course, and the sailor has nothing to do but drift downstream until the helmsman regains control of the boat's course. When the boat demands attention, one can't dream, so I tipped the last glass on board, lowered the glass onto the cockpit sole, and let go of the front sail sheets. I reacted in time and still had enough rudder to change course, so I turned northeast and set a new course. I sailed far enough away from the shore, and the new course put me back on track, even though I was further east and out of danger from the leeward shore. I pulled up the mainsail and then the Genoa until the boat was back into a comfortable rhythm on the new course, and went into the cabin to pour myself a new glass of iced tea. For a minute, I wondered if the storm had moved inland as it often does in the mid-Atlantic states. No matter. When you're at sea, you deal with the reality in front of you and prepare for what awaits you. There was work to be done at sea, but it was nothing compared to the struggles of the last few weeks at home, and I grinned to myself as I remembered the mess I was in the morning after Sheila left. Then I said a brief prayer of thanks that my father had long ago taught me never to drink alcohol when the boat was in motion. You can tie yourself to the mast and drink yourself into a stupor when you're at anchor, but while you're sailing you stay sober. I carried my glass to the cockpit sole and made myself comfortable. The sails were well tensioned, the autopilot was maintaining the set course, and the sea was getting a little rough. But it wasn't something Voyager and I couldn't handle. For a while my thoughts were freed from the pain and feelings of inferiority I'd been living with for the past few weeks. As I looked at the sails, I put my hand on the mainsail to feel the power that Voyager had harnessed and thought, there is power in this, there is grace and beauty. The sails are driving my boat forward. There is no hesitation, no uncertainty. There is only forward motion into a future that I myself am creating. There were no other boats nearby, and feeling confident in my decision to leave, I let my thoughts drift back to the weeks that had passed. That morning, after our second skirmish, I woke up after dawn. I was distraught. Was this really death? I felt disoriented and confused. As the fog in my head began to clear and the events of the previous night came flooding back at me, a splitting headache consumed my brain. I felt as if I had been robbed and I was both the victim and the attacker. Just in time, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and pulled myself into a sitting position. I staggered into the bathroom and took a long look in the mirror. The sight was not a pleasant one. I was unfamiliar with this kind of drinking and could count on the fingers of one hand the number of hangovers I'd had in my life. I won't even try to describe what was in the bathroom and hoped I left it all there instead of scattering it all over the carpets and floor of the house. Said I heard the phone ring and practically jumped out of my skin. Shut up. Yeah, that would work. Eventually, the ringing of the phone stopped and all that was left was the ringing in my skull. I took a pack of aspirin and sat on the edge of the bed. Slowly and with great pain, everything began to come back to me. The bickering, the screaming, the slamming of doors, it all came back. Shit. I knew I needed a shower and a toothbrush to dislodge the taste of cat litter from my mouth. Stumbling, I walked back to the bathroom and began the process of tidying up, still operating on my personal autopilot. In time, between the aspirin and the shower, I began to feel human again. As I gathered my clothes from the evening, threw them in the hamper, got dressed, and stumbled down the stairs to the kitchen. I finally began to think straight. I needed coffee. I was hungry, but the thought of scrambled eggs kept my stomach churning, so I grabbed 2 brownies from the box that tasted like cardboard and threw them in the toaster. 20 minutes later, I felt like I could finally take control of my broken life. The phone rang again, and it was Sheila's sister, Birdie. What kind of person names their child Beatrice these days? Birdie and Sheila, their parents, should do time for child abuse. I picked up the phone and said, "What?" The outburst did nothing for me. What's the idea of kicking my sister out of her own house? Who the hell do you think you are? She continued on for a while longer. I put her on speaker so I didn't have to hold the phone to my ear and just let her continue until she ran out of breath. When she finally finished, I asked, "Are you done?" She wasn't done, and my question prompted another round of swearing. Not wanting to listen any further, I hung up the phone. The phone rang again, and I let it ring. 10 minutes later, when it rang again, I picked it up and said, "What?" Well, it didn't work the first time. It didn't work the second time either. What's the idea of hanging up on me? Who the hell do you think? I hung up again. 2 minutes later, the phone rang, and a very chastened Bertie said, "Okay, I've already calmed down. May I ask why you think you can kick your wife out of the house?" I simply said, "Put Johnny on." "What?" I said, "Dress your husband. I'll explain everything to him." I knew Bertie and I knew Johnny, and I knew it was time to share the pain. Johnny picked up the phone. "Billy, what the hell is going on?" He always called me Billy and was the only one who did. I liked Johnny. We could be men together when we needed to be and children together when we wanted to be. Johnny was a stand-up guy. "Johnny, I have something to tell you and you need to think about it. Sheila dropped a bombshell on me last night. She announced that she's having an affair and she intends to pursue it. She's already having fun with a guy and wants to start spending more evenings and some weekends with him. Plus, she wants me to be okay with it." A silence hung on the other end while Johnny digested what I told him. "Billy, this doesn't make sense. You want to hear it from her own lips." I recorded the conversation. Johnny must have hesitated because it took him a moment to answer me. Maybe I'll come over and we can talk. Sit now." I told him to grab some beer on the way and that I was out of bourbon. He was there 30 minutes later. I told him the story from the beginning and turned on the tape. The recording was choppy, and Sheila's voice wasn't delivered as well as I would have liked, but he believed it. It was then that I began my scorched earth campaign. "Johnny, you've known these two sisters as long as I have. Can you say they have secrets from each other?" "Never." "So how do you think Bertie knows Sheila was having an affair?" He straightened up, and for a moment seemed to stare into space. Then he turned to me again, and this time I saw an anger in his eyes that gave me hope. "Did you hear the way she pestered me about kicking Sheila out of the house? You think she didn't know why?" He heard every word. I knew the man, so when he said, "I sure as hell hate cheaters," I knew I'd made my point. Bertie wasn't going to bother me anymore. She had her own problems. I took my mind off my thoughts to look up at the roof, then moved to the low side of the boat to get a better look at the jib. The wind had died down and the sails were pulling well, so I leaned back on the cockpit sole and began to reminisce about the days leading up to the end of my marriage. Unfortunately, the fight that had taken place at Johnny's house that evening had resulted in him kicking Sheila out of the second house in as many days. When there was a knock on the door and I opened it, there stood Sheila, asking if she could come home. I made a mental calculation and decided that I was in control of my temper by then. Besides, my course had been chosen. "You can stay under 2 conditions." She nodded, but there was no hint of remorse on her face. "First, you must tell me if you have ever entertained your boyfriend in this house." She quickly replied, "No, I would never do that with you. But you would have entertained him somewhere else, right?" To this she had no answer. I had anticipated this and was already preparing for bachelorhood, so I said, "Second, I've moved into the guest room. You can keep our bedroom until the divorce is final." But she began, "I don't want to hear anything from you. You can sleep here, but don't you dare bring that asshole into my house. Do you understand me?" She started to act defiant, but nodded in agreement and went off to her room. I didn't see her again for the rest of that night. Sitting alone in the living room, I decided to take advantage of her self-isolation and continued working on the list. Following Carol's lesson, I put my mind into work mode, grabbed my laptop and started a new list. It included bank accounts, investments, retirement accounts, house, cars, college tuition, and on and on and on. A person's life can get complicated after the age of 50. I knew enough about divorce to know that if I wasn't careful, I would lose half of everything and more. Sheila worked, but she didn't earn as much as I did. The house was mostly paid off, and we had set up tuition funds for both kids, so I felt their college educations were secure. My retirement, on the other hand, would be in jeopardy. I made arrangements to sell the house, but I wasn't going to live in it anymore. It soon became apparent that there were only a limited number of things I could do legally. Any attempt to hide money was going to fail. The short list of things I could do boiled down to just 4 things. I could divide our simple savings, move some of what we owned into storage in hopes of keeping it, leave town, and file for divorce. In the end, I gave up thoughts of revenge and decided I would settle for freedom and fair distribution. In the morning, I split the bank accounts and canceled the joint credit cards. This gave me the funds I needed to make a fresh start. Then, I disconnected her cell phone. That should have gotten her attention. The investment accounts were in our joint names, and there was nothing I could do without her assistance. The lawyers would take care of that. The advantage of my not being able to separate those accounts was that she couldn't do anything about it either. It also meant they were safe. They would be dealt with in the divorce. I then rented 2 single-story warehouses in the city. That evening, I was surprised to check items off my list. There was nothing else I could do, so I started thinking about preparing for my new life. What distracted me from my musings was the increased commercial traffic southward from New York. Those big ships can catch up with a fellow traveler faster than you think, so it was time to get back to work. It was a long day, but I made it to my destination by late afternoon. I set sail beyond the Manasquan River cut off, and just before sunset found a comfortable harbor inside. I never liked to enter a harbor after dark. It's too easy to lose your bearings. Nevertheless, it was a fine day, albeit a very long one, and for the first time in nearly a month my thoughts were clear. The wind was fair, though the sea had picked up, but I was making good time. I selected a place for a berth and paid the harbor master for his trouble. I was 2 days out and needed a shower and shave. Then I needed a good meal. Sailing clears the mind, and the sea can be primal. Together, they make a person think about basic things like food, drink, a hot shower, and a comfortable place to sleep. I had one, so I went in search of the other 3. The marina had showers for boaters. Good marinas usually do that. Feeling refreshed, I found a place a few blocks from the marina that offered fish and chips with a good local IPA, and that allowed me to accomplish the last 2 items on my list for tonight. I felt satisfied and tired as I walked back to my boat. It had been a second very long day, and I laid down in my bunk. My last thoughts were of the next day. I suspected that the storm would catch up with me, and I would stay in the harbor until it subsided. Comforted that I was safe, I fell asleep immediately. Day 3, Tuesday, rain and wind. A tropical depression has reached the shores of New Jersey. The rain started in the middle of the night and awakened me from my slumber. I had lowered the dodger when I secured the boat and thought I had closed enough cabin hatches to keep most of the rain out and let some air in. But a boat at the dock can't rotate freely in the wind like an anchored boat. So if the wind comes up from behind, the rain hits the cabin hatch. The rain whipped across my face, waking me from my slumber. I battened down the hatch, closed and locked the forward hatch, checked the dock lines, and went back to sleep. Morning came and it was still raining. It was one of those days. I had made good progress, so I could afford to take it easy. What choice did I have anyway? I certainly wasn't going out to sea in a baby storm. The mooring lines held, Voyager didn't resist, and I settled down to get some more sleep. I needed it. When I finally woke up, I decided to make my first hot breakfast of the entire voyage. I started by boiling some water to make coffee. Drinking it made me feel human again. Then I fried some bacon in a frying pan, diced a small jalapagzo, and added it to the pan, made scrambled eggs in the fat from the bacon, added it all to 2 flour tortillas with a good handful of shredded cheddar and sprinkled with salsa verde, which I had brought just for that purpose. I rolled both tortillas into a tight roll, cut each one in half, and sat back to enjoy the sound of the rain and a hearty breakfast. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly content. I had bought Voyager to sail, not to sleep in. The cockpit was spacious and allowed better sail handling for the standard crew, while the cabin was small and cramped. With the relatively minor changes I had made, it was perfect for one person walking away from their pain. After finishing my meal and drinking my second cup of coffee, I began to think about the day ahead. In the meantime, I pulled out my weather gear and looked around the deck. Everything was just as it should be. The sailcloth cover protected the main sail, the jib was stowed, the jib was below deck in the bow bunk, and all the halyards were tied down. Everything was in order, and I went back to the cabin, took off my rain gear, and made myself comfortable for a quiet, rainy day. It wasn't quite the day I had hoped for. I knew that as I sailed north I would have plenty of time to think about Sheila and her betrayal, but I knew that the necessities of the ship would allow me a distraction to interrupt my thoughts. Today, however, there would be no distraction unless I made an effort to do so myself. So I looked around the cabin and found the box of books I had packed for the trip. There were only about a dozen or so books in it. Some of them were my favorites and a few were new. I packed books not only for the trip, but also for new beginnings. I didn't know how soon I would be back for the rest of my possessions, and I wanted to have something familiar with me to start a new life. Almost instinctively, I picked up Steinbeck's Canning Row. This book had been one of my favorites for most of my life, but now it took on a special significance, as if reflecting my own life. Doc was an intelligent man who appreciated those around him, but lived in a state of self-isolation. I turned to the back of the story and began reading the scene at the end of the book, where Mac and the boys throw a party for Doc. Doc has friends who care about him, and soon the party takes on a life of its own. It gets rowdy, the police arrive, and soon join the party, and it escalates, and Doc finds himself on the edge, watching his friends having fun. It seemed like an apt metaphor for my own life. There was always a part of the loner in me that marveled at the interest and support of good friends. I knew that in time, there would be new friends with unexpected challenges, as well as old friends. This was not the end, but a new beginning and a transition of sorts. I needed to go through this period of isolation to cleanse myself of old pain and be ready for the new relationships that lay ahead. As I read the book, my thoughts returned to the weeks leading up to my departure. Sheila and I lived even less like roommates and more like ships passing in the night. We each went to work, though honestly I never knew if she was working or dating her new crush. She would come home late with no explanation, and I never asked for an explanation. We cooked our own meals, not caring about the other. She made condescending attempts to get me back into her bed, but the very thought of it disgusted me. I'd given her 25 years of devotion and affection, but she'd gotten bored and wanted something new. To hell with her. Meanwhile, I was talking to upper management at work. I wanted to move, and quite pickily at that. Fortunately, there was a job opening in Maine, and it suited me just fine. The company appreciated me and was flexible about when I would start work. Sheila then provided me with the most convenient opportunity I could have hoped for. It was on a Tuesday night, about 2 weeks after she dropped the bombshell. She came home late as usual and announced, "Since you show no interest in me, I'll be gone this weekend. A friend of mine is taking me to New York for a show. I'll leave Friday after work and be home on Sunday." "You mean George? Or is that a new friend?" I was being sarcastic, and I had no desire to apologize for it. She merely glared at me and left for her bedroom, slamming the door as she went. In the teenage confrontation that had become our lives, I counted that as my victory. She was off having fun in New York, but she was still getting it here. So what did I care? Besides, it would make it easier for me to leave this way. And Friday morning came and I watched her walk to her car with a small suitcase. She wasn't going to be back after work, so I started getting ready. I went through my closet, packing most of my clothes into boxes that I lined with large plastic garbage bags to keep everything dry. Winter clothes were packed for storage, and summer clothes were packed for transportation. I packed books and electronics for storage, except for the few books I'll be taking with me. Then I packed up the tools. A few things I wanted to take out of the marriage, like pictures of the kids, went into storage. I kept all the furniture except the office desk and chair and the big comfy leather couch that Sheila couldn't stand. All in all, not a lot of things to leave as a legacy for a life lived, but I was never in the business of accumulating material possessions. The last things I packed were guitars. I had an acoustic guitar with steel strings and a cheap classical guitar. I liked the classical because the nylon strings fit comfortably under my fingers, and I could work the strings, building up notes as I played. The steel string was a great machine, but the classical was very organic in my hands. When I held it in my hands, it felt like a part of me. I also had one of those indestructible plastic travel guitars that I used to take with me on the boat this time of year. It was always a relaxing way to spend an evening enjoying the passing day and watching the sunset. I'd already rented 2 single-story storage units in town, and rented a small truck to move my stuff there. On Saturday morning, A few good friends came over to help me load the truck, and by lunchtime everything was moved into the warehouse. Only later did I find out that my friends had grabbed a few things they thought I might need someday and added them to the storage unit. The second compartment I used for my car. From that point on, I took an Uber or asked a friend for one. A man needs good friends, and I never needed an Uber. I invited my friends over for lunch, and we discussed my plans. Everyone was sworn to secrecy, and as we talked, I was amazed at the disgust they had for Sheila. It turned out that my best friends had never liked my wife, but they had the nobility to never tell me until that day. Later that night, as I prepared for the longest solo swim of my life, I reflected on the true value and graciousness of good friends. "So, Bill, what are our plans now?" Craig asked. Asked Craig. I had known him the longest, and at that moment the thought of not seeing him again caused me more pain and disappointment than breaking up with Sheila. I asked Craig to hold my guitars, not wanting to put them in an unconditioned garage as summer approached, and he readily agreed. I knew they'd be safe with him, and just as well I knew I'd see him again. I have a few things in the house, clothes, and a few books I'll take with me. I think I'll buy provisions tonight and get settled on the ship. Tomorrow morning I will set sail and begin my journey. Are you still heading north? Can't we convince you to stay? That was Pete. I realized now that they were taking turns entering the conversation intentionally or not to let me know they all cared. I shook my head. Too much pain and too many memories. I've already arranged to transfer at work and found an apartment online. That will solve my immediate problems once I get there. And once things settle down there, I'll fly back and get the car in boxes. I'll probably have to rent a small truck and haul the car in a trailer, but that's okay. What are you going to do with Sheila? Jack had a look that could only be described as disgust. I was meeting with a lawyer the week she dropped the bombshell on me. The kids are grown and she has a job. It's going to cost me, but that's the deal. You seem to be taking it surprisingly well. Actually, I'm going to get out of town before I kill that bitch. That elicited a laugh, and I had to smile. I wasn't exactly joking, but the fact that I wanted to start over and end the pain was true. There's only one big question left. Pete leaned across the table, pushed his glasses up on his nose, and looked at me intently. It was hard not to laugh before he finished. Pete is a lovely man and the furthest from tough of anyone I've ever known. What do you want us to do with George? And how do you want us to dispose of the body? And I don't think another serious word was uttered for the rest of the day. As I sat in the cabin of the Voyager with an unread book in my hands, the sudden rocking of the boat brought me out of my reverie. It was raining lightly, and I poked my head out of the hatch. It was only a lobster boat passing close by, and its noise broke the stillness of the morning. Probably he had refueled for tomorrow. It was unlikely he had left the harbor this day. I shut the hatch cover and continued my meditation. At Saturday afternoon, I said goodbye to the bulk of my friends, promising to send them my contact information as soon as I was settled. Craig drove me to get the last of my belongings at the house. He then escorted me to the grocery store and dropped me off at the marina. After loading up the provisions, I invited him to have a drink with me. Oh yes, I forgot to mention that while packing, I emptied out the liquor cabinet and then deposited it with the rest of my possessions. It turns out that the liquor cabinet I built myself years ago holds better memories for me than the marital bed on which our children were conceived. I spent hours pondering this and similar things. Funny how it only took Sheila 2 weeks to change my attitude about everything in my universe. Craig and I sat in the cockpit of Voyager, sipping bourbon and talking about the surprises and twists and turns life throws our way. You don't deserve this, Bill. I hope you know that. It's not what you did. You were betrayed and made an unacceptable demand. There was nothing more you could have done. I nodded, and in my heart I realized that Craig was right. I wasn't cut out for the life of a cuckold. You know, next to the Chesapeake, I think Maine is the most interesting place I could settle. There's lots of forests and farmland, and the towns are small. The sailing is good, and there are lots of islands to explore, and harbors are up and down the coast. I think I'd like it there. Craig looked at me seriously and said, Don't forget that if you run aground, it won't be a sandbar you run into. There are rocks everywhere, and if you're not careful, they'll rip the keel off your boat." The thought crossed my mind, but I couldn't let him leave on such a serious note. There's really only one thing bothering me. What's that? Is it okay to put Old Bay on a lobster? It was a silly joke, but we were both born and raised in Maryland, and knew that problems could come from the most unexpected places. Maybe more to the point, I was looking for any reason to laugh, if only for a moment. It was the last few hours of my life in Maryland, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. "Old Bay can be added to everything," said Craig. With those words, we raised our glasses and finished the last of our drinks in relative silence. As the sun was already setting, Craig stood up and said, "You know, I should go home. Are you going to be okay?" I thought for a moment and nodded. I've got a lot to go through, but now that I've chosen to go, I feel like I'll finally be okay. I looked at my friend and asked, "Are we still going to Boston?" "Yes, of course." He hugged me and got out of the boat. As he started down the pier, he stopped and turned around. "You know, none of us are going to tell her where you are. Not your friends, not our wives, no one. Whether you tell her or not, she won't find out from us." I nodded my thanks. I had already decided that I wasn't going to hide. "I'm just leaving her." He looked around a few times as he walked to his car. As I stood and watched him walk away, I knew I was leaving good friends behind, but I also knew they would remain a part of my life for years to come. I wondered briefly if Sheila could say the same thing. Left alone, I finished stowing my gear. I found dry spots for the few books and boxes of clothes I had brought with me. With food, in some ways, things are both more difficult and worse. Ice keeps for a few days at sea if you don't open the icebox, but only a very few days. Steaks don't keep any longer than ice, and fresh vegetables keep about the same amount of time. I knew the first few days would be long, and I wouldn't have time to cook a real meal, so I bought canned meats and vegetables. They're not too refined, but they do power the car. Dried spices can be stored for a while, but there is high humidity at sea. The best way to flavor a dish is with canned chili peppers, basil, and tomato pesto, and jars of red and green salsa. Eggs can be stored as long as they are not broken. Pasta sounds good, but water boils slowly, and pasta requires too much water. Bread and crackers will be stored in airtight plastic bags. After Craig left and my supplies were stowed, I headed to bed. I had already notified the marina of my departure, and there was nothing else to do that night. The next morning I had to get up early and leave, so I decided to get some sleep while I had the chance. Lying on the bunk, I tried to sleep, but sleep came slowly. My mind was a mishmash of anger and pain, with trepidation about the life ahead of me. I was plagued by conflicting doubts and determination. But in the end, I realized that this was the only way forward. The sound of water against the ship's hull was soothing, until sleep finally overcame me. Disconnected from my thoughts, I looked around my cramped quarters and felt strangely at home. I had food, clothes, something to occupy my thoughts, and a warm, dry place to sleep. It didn't seem like much, but it was all I needed that day. I decided to put the book aside and lay down on my bunk to sleep for a few minutes. I was still exhausted from the first 2 days and all the preparation before I left. I woke up around 2 p.m. and made myself a plate of cheese and crackers. With a glass of hot tea and a little honey, it was the perfect late lunch. A quick glance around showed that everything was fine on Voyager, so I settled in with my guitar and snacks and played through the evening. I spent a fair amount of time that day reflecting on the past. When it got dark, I ate a bowl of cereal for dinner and went to bed early. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. Day 4, Wednesday. I had another long voyage ahead of me, and the North Jersey coast is notorious for having too few safe harbors. I set off before dawn with my Dodger set in Harnison, passing the last stretch of Manasquan and out into the Atlantic when the sun had already risen above the horizon. The wind was moderate, but there was plenty of it. Plus, there was a wave left over from the storm the day before. The wind was going to pick up as the day progressed, so I spread the sail and set a course to the northeast. This was the most dangerous crossing of the entire voyage. I had to cross the main shipping lanes to and from New York City, and I had to watch out for big ships. Everything was clean, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time making breakfast, so I made myself a bowl of cereal and settled down on the cockpit sole to eat and watch the traffic. Day and night, around the clock, big ships passed through this part of the coast. Coast Guard regulations state that a vessel under sail has the right to outrun a vessel under motor. Many sailors never learn that this rule applies only to recreational motorboats. Sailboats do not have right-of-way over commercial vessels, and experience teaches that a sailboat claiming right-of-way over a commercial tanker or cargo ship goes down, and its skipper is rarely seen again. I felt like Gulliver in the land of giants. I spent the day setting sail and plotting a course between the big ships, and I didn't have time to think about anything else until I rounded the northern tip of Long Island. By the time I found an anchorage close to shore, it was getting dark, and I set the alarm on my GPS in case I pulled anchor. I was exhausted. I had already eaten 2 bowls of cereal and endless glasses of iced tea, and I was too tired to make dinner. I settled on a granola bar and a glass of milk and went to bed. Day 5, Thursday. I woke up before the sun. My dreams this night were not pleasant. I was reliving the days before I left, the days and nights after Sheila dropped the bomb on me. I looked at the surface of the water and thought, the hell with it. I had a few miles to cover today, so I got dressed and started boiling water for coffee. It was going to be a good day. I hoped there would be a strong wind that would allow me to go at a good speed, and I would soon be out of the shipping channels. There would still be some large vessels to encounter, especially until I crossed Block Island Sound, but I hoped the day would be uncomplicated, or at least as uncomplicated as a sailing trip could be. The cabin was cooler in the morning than it had been the day before, and I found the coffee delicious. It warmed my hands before my heart did, and I made a bowl of cereal for breakfast. I seemed to be eating a lot of cold cereal on this trip, much more than usual, but it was comforting and filled my stomach. I'd been gone for 4 days, 5 if you counted loading the truck, and all that time my phone had been off. When you're on the high seas, cell service is almost impossible to get. But in the harbor at night, I didn't even think about turning it on. The last thing I wanted to deal with was Sheila coming at me. This morning my thoughts shifted from Sheila to the kids, and I wondered if they knew I was leaving. I didn't tell them I was leaving. Instead, I planned to contact them as soon as I got to Portland. But if Sheila got to them and found out the boat was gone, she might make them worry unnecessarily. Besides, her remark about my little fight was still burning my gut, and I drank all I was going to swallow. I turned my phone on so the kids wouldn't worry and waited for it to do the usual turn-on procedure. Eventually, I heard the usual cacophony of beeps and beeps announcing that I had mail messages and texts. These were texts and emails from friends who wanted to know I was okay. It never occurred to me that they were also monitoring the weather and might be worried about me. Sitting alone in my little house, their messages touched my heart. Rumors of my departure had reached me, and I received a flood of support. But those who knew where I was going kept their promise, so everyone wanted to know where I was and where I was going. I decided to send one group message and told them, I'm fine. I've had 3 good days of steady winds, spent the storm in a safe harbor, and am making good progress. After thinking about it for a while, I decided there was no point in keeping it a secret any longer and added, I am sailing to Maine and hope to be there in a few days. The boat handles great, and I realize now that I made a great choice in buying her. She can do everything I demand of her and more. It's a great change. I then added a smile emoji. I figured they would get the joke. The kids called and texted me and seemed worried. I'd kept them in the dark all this time and hadn't told them anything about their mother's new lifestyle, but they needed to know why I left. They're adults and Sheila had made her own bed, plus the divorce papers were ready and probably served shortly after I left. So I sent them a quick text letting them know I was okay, that I was sailing to Maine and promised to tell them more later. I ended by saying that I loved them and always would. I realized later that my cryptic message might have alarmed them even more, and I didn't want that. Finished with that, I moved on to calls and text messages from Sheila. I considered just deleting them, but information is power, and I figured I could listen to her nastiness one more time. I started with the phone messages. They began with insults and tirades about how my not being home on Sunday night had inconvenienced her. Typical. By Monday she was annoyed, and by Tuesday she was pissed off. All in all, it was business as usual. I guess she had been served on Wednesday because around noon that day, she lashed out at me. What did she expect? After 25 years, she should have known I would never put up with that kind of crap. She'd shown some degree of concern in her last few calls, but who knows why, and was it genuine? I listened to them all but didn't respond to anything. Then I went to her text messages, and they followed the same sequence. From annoyed to pissed off, very pissed off, and concerned again. No surprise there. I thought about her with George, and all my anxiety for her dissipated. I decided that I would give her one clear and definite answer, so I wrote her that it was all over between us. I had left her. She had the papers. She must sign them. And that was all. And then I read a short message from my lawyer that the papers had been served. I had guessed that. The simplicity and directness of his message appealed to me at that moment. I had one more thing to do before I could turn my phone off. I didn't know if I would have a connection that day, so I sent Craig a message. Weather permitting, I plan to stop a new bed for tonight in Plymouth tomorrow. After that, I can get to Boston or Gloucester and then Portsmouth. I won't be in touch tonight, but drop me a message and I'll reply when I get to the harbor tonight. Craig was aware of my plans from the start, and I promised to pick him up somewhere on the coast as I moved north. By the time I was done with breakfast and phone messages, the sun had already risen, but I had time to enjoy a second cup of coffee, and I sat in the cockpit and watched the sunrise. It was a new day, and for the first time, I felt like it was truly a fresh start. I was halfway there and no longer running from the pain and what I thought was my defeat. Now I was running towards a new life. The fishermen were already on the water when I was ready to drop anchor. The wind was blowing from the west, and I set a course northeast toward Buzzards Bay. I still hadn't decided how to get past Cape Cod. The idea of going farther out to sea and rounding the cape from the east was very appealing. But this was my first solo voyage on the open ocean. Besides, I had other commitments. Once past New Shoreham, I turned 10 degrees to the east and steered Voyager into a wide swath on the port side. The mainsail, jib and Genoa were pulling well, and I was starting to get my best time ever sailing. The sea was gently rolling in, and Voyager was rhythmically rising and falling as I gained miles under keel. I thought, here's the thing. I have a good boat under my feet, a steady breeze behind me, and a goal that calls to me. I need more of that, and less of what I left behind. And soon I was back in the same position that had gotten me this far. I sat on the floor of the cockpit, reflecting on my journey, and watched the ships. There wasn't much to see, and that suited me just fine. If all went according to plan, each leg of the journey from this point on would be shorter than along the coast of New Jersey and Long Island. There were safe harbors all along the route from this point on, and I almost didn't need to do enough miles to find a safe place to spend the night. As with the previous days, my thoughts began to wander. I wondered why Sheila had never been able to appreciate sailing. It was liberating and exhilarating, as I assumed flying must be as well. The sails are picked up by an invisible wind, and the sea beats against the hull, propelling you forward mile after mile. The boat demands your attention, but it also gives you time to think. Time to think. Why did she decide she needed more than what we have? Our life together has always been everything I needed. Why wasn't it enough for me? What was so magical about this George? And how could she imagine I would sit idly by while she went to bed with another man? And then it hit me, for all the things she'd unleashed on me. For all her condescension and betrayal, I still didn't know who this man was. Was he someone she worked with? If so, I never met him. I don't even remember her mentioning him in conversation. Was he someone new in her life? Or had she kept him a secret for longer than she admitted? She definitely lied to me about not sleeping with him already. Was he someone who came to her office from time to time? Or was he just enough of a short visit to turn my wife's head? My anger flared for a moment, and I stared at the eastern horizon to clear my head. Someone was sailing close on the port side, heading south across the bay. I wondered where he was sailing from and where he was going. Our courses intersected several miles apart, so I pulled out my monocular to get a better look at the terrain. Some people aren't familiar with monoculars, but they are just one half of binoculars. Admittedly, they are more convenient to use on a rolling sea, and I quickly focused on the other boat. There was a man about my age sitting at the helm, and a woman was coming up from above through the cabin hatch. She placed 2 mugs on the cockpit sole, exited the cabin and picked them up again, carrying one to the man who appeared to be her husband. I wonder what it's like to sail with a spouse and share the experience with your mate, your partner. They briefly studied me, or perhaps Voyager, but were too far away from me to notice I was watching them. I suppose they, like me, were just admiring the vessel passing by. I smiled and let vanity take over for a moment. I knew Voyager was a beautiful vessel, and briefly considered raising the spinnaker, but I was quickly dissuaded. The spinnaker would become a nuisance if the wind changed quickly, or I needed to change course. I waved, but was too far away for them to notice me. They seemed to be talking, and I saw that the man was laughing. For the first time since I had left Whitehall Bay, I felt truly alone. Up until now, I had been a lonely traveler. But now I was someone else. I was uprooted. I was separated from everything and everyone except Voyager, and for a moment I wondered what it would be like to share my life with a woman who only wanted to be with me. I put those thoughts out of my mind and reminded myself to turn on my cell phone when I got to the port to talk to the kids. I needed to hear their voices and explain my decision. I hoped for their support, but only time would tell how they would react. After all, Sheila was their mother. They had to show at least some measure of loyalty to her. For the first time, I began to wonder what price I might pay for my new life. I surveyed the water ahead of me. There were still a few boats leaving their harbors to swim or fish, but today was Thursday, the beginning of the season, so it was far from crowded. Soon I would be in Buzzards Bay, and by late morning more company would be on my way. The image of a man and his wife sailing south never left my mind. They looked happy, and I remembered a time when Sheila and I seemed the same to each other. Before the children were born, we were carefree, and it seemed like every day was a honeymoon. When the kids were born, life got even better. When they were little, I helped Sheila after work, so she didn't have to do everything herself. The kids grew up, and we read them bedtime stories. Then they went to school, and we helped them with their homework. It was all the little things that family offers parents, and I loved it all. I never felt like I was getting old or that time was slipping away from me. At every age, I felt like I was perfectly fine and living a contented life. When did things start to change? I guess when Sheila went back to work, she became more distracted. I didn't blame her at the time. She had been a stay-at-home mom for 7 years. She needed the freedom and the opportunity to be an adult again. Freedom. What a strange word. I thought the chance to go back to work and have adult conversations again was freedom. She, on the other hand, thought having fun with another man was freedom. Now I wonder if we ever agreed on the meaning of the word, or the value of our life together. I was having a good time and wondering when and where I would meet Craig. Hopefully I'll find out tonight. The solo sailing was exciting, but I had to admit that I was now looking forward to the company. Maybe with Craig on board, we can show off a bit and raise the spinnaker. And there's another expression that used to mean something else entirely, showing off. I kept pictures of Sheila and the kids on my desk and on the cabinet behind my chair. Every few years I added new ones as the kids got older. I had a beautiful family and it was showing off. I packed up these photos when I put things in storage, although the thought crossed my mind to cut Sheila out of them. But she too was part of my past, and it was impossible to rewrite it. I wondered if I would like my new office, and wondered if the kids would agree to having a picture of the 3 of us on my new desk. Jack was great. He ran my company's Annapolis office. When I went to him to tell him about what was going on with Sheila, he took off his boss hat and put on his friend hat. He never once made me feel guilty for wanting to leave. On the contrary, he sat with me and helped me plan. When I told him I needed to get out of town and start a new life, he was the one who told me about the job opening in Portland. It was the same company doing the same job in a different city. It was a step up for me. Phil, You know I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here, spit in her eyes and find the prettiest girl in town to hold your hand. But you know I went through a divorce for the same reason you did. And to this day I wish I had left town and never looked back. I see that damn cheating bitch and her new husband everywhere I go. You never get used to it." I just sat there and nodded my head. He'd lived through it, and I could see what that choice offered me. I wasn't going to live like this. I know a guy who runs an office in Portland. He's a good and stand-up guy. You'll like him. If you want, I'll set you up with an interview. I didn't need to think about it. Make the call, Jack. Tell him I can fly in and do the interview at his convenience. An hour later, Jack was in my office. "You have an interview Tuesday morning. Carol is already preparing your tickets and hotel for you. I suggest you stay at least Tuesday night and look at a few apartments. There's no point in trying to find a house right away. It's better to familiarize yourself with the surroundings first." I flew in Monday night and returned home on Thursday. By the time I returned, I had a new job, a new apartment, and a place to moor my boat. Things were looking up, and for the first time since Sheila dropped the bomb, I felt like I was taking my life into my own hands. Thinking back, I told Sheila I needed to get out of town for work, and she never questioned it. She never asked where I was going or how long I would be there. I guess that as much as anything else said that my marriage was dead. I was now flying a parallel course north, though traveling slower than the jet that had gotten me to Portland a few weeks earlier. I checked the map and satellite navigation and saw that I was approaching the shipping lanes from Providence. I didn't expect there to be much shipping traffic, but it was enough to keep me from thinking about the past. I rose from the cabin floor, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and sat down so that I was comfortable looking in all directions. It was time to pay attention. Better than Providence, there's Newport at the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Some will argue with me, but I consider Newport and Annapolis the sailing capitals of the East Coast. Some will say Annapolis is a close second, and if we're talking wealth, that's probably true. Newport is the traditional home of the America's Cup, and as they say, money attracts money. However, I think on a per capita basis, Annapolis has more dedicated boaters. There are a lot of single-design yachts there, and a lot of handicap racing. If you add all the professional boaters and recreational fishermen, you get a lot of boats and a lot of marinas, and a lot of bars open late into the night. I was passing Newport far offshore, and was hoping I would get to see a 12-meter yacht spreading its sails. But I was out of luck today. It was a Thursday in the start of the season, so there were only avid sailors on the boat. I guess I was one of them now. Why wouldn't I be? I had done a solo offshore voyage out of Annapolis and was sailing onward to Maine. Then it hit me. I should start a journal for Voyager. I would document my offshore voyage, recording miles traveled, wind and sea conditions. It would be a record of my new life. It seemed like a good thing to do, but I never did it. It was nothing more than a grandiose, fleeting thought. I've always lived in the moment, and Voyager would be no exception. Instead, I was content to watch the other sailors as we sailed by, and knew they envied Voyager's lines and ease of movement. That was my style. By now, I was well past Newport and sailing at a good pace. The wind had changed to a northwest wind, and I set the sail so that they followed the beam. Now, Voyager was really flying. I entered Buzzards Bay, and the sea got a little smaller. I had passed the shipping lanes, and now I had time for a snack. I really wanted an egg salad sandwich, but all the eggs were raw. Not wanting to boil water while the ship rocked on the waves, I settled on a crispy peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich. It turned out so delicious that I ate a second one. My appetite was returning, and I thought that was probably a good sign. Food hadn't appealed to me since Sheila had dictated her terms. Nothing had attracted me at all then. Now I was several hundred miles from home, and even now, thinking about it, I was gaining miles under my keel. I made it halfway across and headed down the slope. Toward noon I saw a few more boats, but not many. I told myself I was made of sturdier material and laughed. I wasn't sturdy. I just didn't need to be at work. Deciding I'd had enough of thinking about Sheila and the insufferable crap I'd left behind for the day, I settled down on the bench in the cockpit and watched Voyager make her way into Buzzards Bay. She's just lovely. The cockpit allows me to adjust the sails to changing wind conditions adding or removing sail to keep the rudder balanced and neutral. A small adjustment to the jib, a few degrees on the auto-helm, and Voyager responds. This is what I had been longing for. When I did the right thing, I was rewarded. When I screwed up, she told me so. We communicated. This boat and me. We had an agreement, a contract. I would take care of her, and she wouldn't let me down. I lowered the sails in New Bedford Harbor and moved upriver. It was easy to find a parking lot close to town and restaurants early in the season, and almost as easy to find a hot shower. I went back to the boat to pull out my cell phone and read a text message from Craig. He was going to meet me tomorrow night in Plymouth. There were messages from the kids, too, full of questions and concerns. I would take my time and answer them tonight. Then, feeling ready for civilized company again, I went in search of an Italian restaurant where I could eat the pasta I had been craving. I got a large plate of carbonara and a nice salad with a glass of Chianti, and returned to Voyager, a very satisfied man. By the time I got back to the boat, the sun had long since set, but I wanted to celebrate. I got over the hump, the boat was going well, and I would have company tomorrow night. Pouring myself a glass of bourbon, I sat back down to write a message to my children. A light breeze was blowing, keeping the bugs at bay, so I sat in the cockpit with my back against the side of the cabin and gathered my thoughts as I watched the tourists strolling by. People watching had always been a favorite pastime of mine, and I often sat in the mall and watched shoppers when I accompanied Sheila on her shopping trips. It was already a distant memory. She really didn't want me to accompany her for several years now. I wondered when her cheating really started. To hell with it. I thought, and to hell with her too. I've spent too many years worrying about how she feels and what she needs. Does she want to start a new life? Well, this was mine. This was the beginning of my new life, and it would start with me sitting on my boat, sipping bourbon and getting my thoughts together. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it was enough that night. The locals were already dispersing to their homes as I finished drafting my message to the kids. I decided to be brief and to the point. This will be hard for you to understand, and I can't say I understand it myself. Your mother has decided to have a lover. His name is George. I'm not acquainted with him and know nothing about him, but I have no intention of sitting idly by while your mother spends nights in his bed. That's why I left your mother. It's no more complicated than that. I've tried to be a good husband. I admit I'm not perfect, but nobody is. I've been faithful to her since the day we met, and now I have to stand up for myself and demand better than she gives me. You know I love you both. I'm divorcing your mother, but I'm not divorcing you. My commitment to you will never change. I am moving to Maine, and I know this will make your life more difficult, as your mother and I will no longer live under the same roof, or even in the same town. I am sorry that this will affect your life, but I want you to know that there comes a time in everyone's life when they have to do what is right for them. I hope your mother finds what she is looking for, but it won't be with me. Please think about what I have told you and come back to me when you are ready. I will always love you. I still need you and want you in my life. Daddy. By the time I finished my message, I was exhausted and started to think that it was time for me to go to bed. If the weather forecast holds true, tomorrow will be a good day. I will sail through Buzzards Bay and out of the Cape Cod Canal into Cape Cod Bay. If the wind doesn't veer to the north, sailing will be easy, and I should be able to reach Plymouth by Friday evening. Day 6, Friday. Thursday night I slept well. Voyager swayed a little when passing boats made her pull up on the mooring lines, but I slept soundly. Then for the first time since Saturday, I went into town to get breakfast. I was lacking protein in my daily diet, so I grabbed a plate of eggs and bacon with good coffee and orange juice. And feeling good, I went back to the boat and checked my phone. I had messages from both kids. As I expected, they were upset and had questions. I expected them to question my story about their mother and George, but they surprised me. I guess they were more observant as children in a marriage than I was as a husband. They both saw their mother's selfish side more clearly than I did, and believed what I told them. They wanted assurances from me that I would stay in touch, and that they could come visit me once I was settled. and I readily responded and assured them that they would always have an open invitation and a place to stay with me. I missed them dearly, but their love and support lifted my spirits. I can't help but say that I sat there in the cabin and cried. My wife may have betrayed me, but the kids were there for me, and that was enough. When everything was ready and the bedding was put away to dry, I started the engine, dropped the dock ropes, and headed out into Buzzards Bay. Navigating the bay was relaxing. The wind was blowing from the west, there were only a few boats, and I was sailing toward the channel with good timing. The Cape Cod Canal is much like the sea in Decanal, and I knew I might have to pass next to commercial vessels heading the other way. And while I didn't like the idea, I knew I wasn't the first to do it and felt ready. It turned out to be easier than I expected. I lowered the sails at the mouth of the channel and made an easy passage into Cape Cod Bay. I was becoming an old master at this sort of thing. I had time, and Cape Cod Bay is a large, semi-enclosed body of water, open only to the north. The wind veered to the north, making a more direct course along the shoreline impossible. So I set Voyager's course to the northeast and headed toward the middle of the bay. It was liberating. I hoisted the mainsail, jib and genoa, trimmed the sheets, shut off the engine, and felt the boat accelerate. With the wind in her teeth, Voyager lay on her starboard side and headed northeast into open water. It went up and down, rocking slightly on each wave, and it felt like nothing could stop it. It was exhilarating and liberating, and I felt like the two of us could do anything. Tonight, I hardly had time to go downstairs and pour myself a drink. There was no boredom and no sitting on the cockpit sole. I stayed aloft with the wind in my face. I let the auto helmsman steer the boat, but made sure the sails kept taut and kept an eye on the electronic navigation. Voyager was in her element and sailing beautifully. She was the epitome of beauty, power, and grace. I now felt like I was going forward to build my own life. I can build my life anew. I will rise to any situation. I would be able to take on any challenge. I was ready. That's the kind of feeling a strong wind and a good boat can give, and that's how I sailed into the center of Cape Cod Bay. Reaching the center of the bay, I took a tack to the northwest. It was easy. I set a new course on the auto helm, and as the boat turned to port, I released the sheets of the front sail from the starboard pegs. The sail naturally crosses the center line of the boat, and as soon as it crossed it, I secured the sheets and trimmed the sails. The mainsail raked away without too much attention. The transition from port to starboard took about 15 seconds, and as Voyager accelerated, I marveled at how well everything worked. Of course, it would have been faster with a crew, but I did it all myself. The helm was secure and smooth, the sails pulled well, and the hull was surprisingly fast. I checked the navigation, and it appeared that I would easily pass Stage Point, trying to pass east of Solid Horse and Marianne Rocks, and make it to Plymouth before nightfall. As I sailed northwest, I began to think about navigation and those cliffs ahead. In the days before electronic navigation, a skipper made his living by knowing his location regardless of the weather. When fog was coming in, the skipper still needed to know that he was avoiding the dangers ahead. Those cliffs became a metaphor for the decisions that led me here. How did I not notice the rocks ahead when the kids left for college and we became empty people? I assumed things were going my way, but the fog rolled in without me realizing, and the rocks ahead appeared. Was George the rock? Or would it have been someone else if not George? And how many cliffs that I walked around over the years? Unaware that destruction was all around me, I told myself it wouldn't happen again. But like the sailors of the old days, we can't live in complete safety. We pick a crew, set a course, and prepare for what may happen. But there is always danger, and a person needs a good crew and a reliable vessel to deal with the dangers and get to a safe port. I grinned and shook my head. Listen to me. I'm a philosophical sailor. What will I surprise myself with next time? Thoughts of Sheila were left behind me again, and without taking my eyes off the sails or the navigator's screen, I rushed toward Plymouth. It was a bright and windy afternoon, and Voyager was enjoying the waters of Cape Cod Bay. I marveled at how well she had handled the wind and waves while heading north along the New Jersey shore. But here she seemed to play in the semi-shaded waters of the bay. and I sailed on with a light heart and a free spirit. It was early evening, as I was slowly bringing the Voyager into the slip I had rented, when I saw a familiar figure standing on the dock waiting to meet me. Craig had beat me to it. He quickly threw me all the dock ropes, and soon Voyager was standing by. You made it just in time, and so are you. How did you get here from the airport? Craig laughed. The whole world is connected by shuttles and cabs. You just have to find the best option, and I had all day to do it. Craig climbed aboard. He was carrying a canvas duffel bag and didn't look like a sailor at all. Where did you get the duffel bag? I used it for laundry in college. I knew it would come in handy again. He smiled, and I was glad to see him. Just throw the bag downstairs and we'll grab a bite to eat. Craig took me literally and threw his suitcase downstairs to the sound of crashing plates and cups. He threw me a sheepish look with a hint of concern. I laughed too hard to be angry. I think you hit the sink. I closed and locked the hatch, and we headed into town. Tonight we were going to have a dinner appropriate to the moment. We were sailors and wanted steak with a glass or two of whiskey to accompany it. Over dinner, I told him about my journey, and he told me about what was going on back home. It was getting dark by the time we got back to Voyager. As I unlocked the hatch, promising to pour each of us a bourbon, a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, sir, are you William Harris?" Turning around, I saw two uniformed officers and the harbor master standing on the dock next to the yacht. "Yes, what can I do for you?" The older and I assume more experienced officer said, "Well, sir, we've been alerted to keep an eye on you. May we come aboard?" I looked at their hard-soled boots and frowned. "We won't take long." With those words, the senior officer began to climb aboard. "Wait a minute." I didn't say yes. "If you want to come aboard, you can take off your shoes. I don't want you messing up the deck with those soles." Okay, I was being a bit of a jerk, but he could have waited for me to respond to his request. It was clear from the look on his face that he didn't like my answer, but he complied, and I watched as two uniformed officers, two of Plymouth's finest officers, removed their shoes and stepped aboard the Voyager in just their stockings. "Sit down. Make yourselves comfortable," I said with a slight chuckle. The hard bench in the cockpit wasn't very comfortable. The four of us sat in Voyager's cockpit while the harbor master walked back down the dock and waited for the officers. "What can I do for you guys?" They were starting to look a little awkward, and I suspect they were embarrassed. It probably wasn't the first time they'd been embarrassed. "Well, sir, it sounds like your wife is worried about you. She, or perhaps I should say the Annapolis police, has contacted towns along the coast to let us know that you may be passing through here. She says you are troubled." It seemed to me that he disliked that word more than I did, and was looking for a more appropriate way to say it. She says, "I'm crazy." I laughed softly. "Did she say I'm emotionally handicapped?" Craig smiled but tried not to laugh out loud. "She said you've gotten some disturbing information and you might not be acting entirely rationally." My laughter was no longer quiet, and Craig abandoned any attempt to keep a straight face. "Look, guys, my wife dropped a nasty bombshell on me about 4 weeks ago. She's having an affair, and she intends to continue it. Our kids are grown. I've been free to make some changes in my life, and I won't tolerate this kind of disrespect. I've arranged to transfer at work, and I'm moving my boat to Maine. Nothing complicated." Both officers nodded at this point, and I thought I caught a jealous glance from the older one. The younger officer looked at Craig and asked, "Are you traveling with him?" "Didn't travel, but I do now. He sailed from Annapolis on his own, but I'll be joining him from here to Portland." Both men looked at me with renewed respect. "You sailed on this vessel yourself from Annapolis to here?" "Yes. Have you had any trouble?" "None so far." I smiled at the younger man, and he had the nobility to look a little embarrassed. The senior officer looked around the cockpit, looked forward to the bow of the Voyager, and I believe he recognized a well-equipped vessel that was well-maintained. Turning to me, he said, "Well, sir, sorry we bothered you. You seem to have everything under control. We'll just wish you a happy journey, and I hope you find the life you're looking for." When we stood up, I shook their hands and apologized for making them take off their shoes. They laughed and took no offense. would you mind broadcasting coast to coast that I'm not as crazy as my wife wants to make it seem?" They nodded, said they would, and with those words they departed. Craig looked at me. "Man, you're never boring, are you?" I didn't have an answer to that question, so I went downstairs to pour each of us a glass of scotch. We spent the rest of the night sitting in the cockpit of the Voyager, sipping scotch and watching people go about their business. When it was time, we went downstairs, made our bunks, and got some sleep. Day 7, Saturday. Now that Craig had joined me, the sailing changed. We could sail longer, taking turns if we wanted to. There were plenty of ports and plenty of choice. We could set aside time to visit coastal islands, change sails more easily and more often, and cook on the go. Most importantly, I had someone to talk to, and storytelling is Craig's main talent. From that point on, the voyage became quite civilized. Before leaving Plymouth, we took time to have a proper breakfast. Craig couldn't resist pancakes with maple syrup, and for me, a decadent breakfast is always Eggs Benedict. We were both more than happy with our food and the coffee we washed it down with. As we walked back to the boat, Craig said, "You know, all the wives went to your house and trashed Sheila." I think for a brief moment, he imagined what he had said and laughed. "Which wives?" "All of them. My wife, Jack's wife, Pete's wife, Dave's wife, Jerry's wife, Paul's wife. I think my daughter even came with us." I'll admit that for a moment unpleasant thoughts like, "What you sow is what you reap," flashed through my mind. But I became more and more convinced that my new life would not be built on the evils of the past. "If it matters to you, Gloria says she still can't understand why Sheila did it. She always said you were a model husband. That's very nice of her. Actually, she says, why can't you be more like Bill? May Craig help me have a better attitude about my life." As we walked down the pier toward Voyager, I asked, "When are you coming back?" "I have an appointment on Thursday, but Gloria advised me to stay away as long as I can." Okay. You know that girl is crazy about you, don't you?" "Yeah, but sometimes she has a weird way of showing it." I couldn't wipe the smile off my face even if I wanted to. I was thinking that if we have time, we could spend the day sailing around the bay and then spend the night in Provincetown. That would open up our options for tomorrow, and we could easily get to Boston or Port Smith if the wind was a tailwind. Sounds like a plan. Have we enough food on board? I think I saw a market somewhere. We have enough food, and Provincetown has lots of great restaurants. We won't starve, so we did. It was great to have company after almost a week of being alone. I felt like I had gotten over the illness in the weeks leading up to my departure, and even though I knew the pain would return, I was ready to be with other people again. I was ready to be human again. We traveled southeast toward Barnstable, not that far, but then turned east and then north again. When there was a danger of reaching Provincetown too quickly, we turned west again until it was finally time to enter the harbor. We just practiced and enjoyed the day. Dinner was excellent, and we ended the day sitting on the deck until late at night, sipping bourbon and talking. Will you ever find out why? Said I hadn't thought about Sheila all day, and for a moment I was caught off guard. Why? Why did she do what she did? No, she said she was interested in him. I think it's code for an itch she wanted to scratch. She told me she needed the freedom to explore new horizons, whatever that meant. And she just announced that she wanted to do this, George. That's what she said. But she admitted that they were already going to have lunch, dinner, and a little dancing. The way I figured it, if she was telling me even half of what was true, she'd already slept with him. She admitted it. She didn't deny it. Shit, that's so cold. Sorry. No, she's a bitch. There's no doubt about that now. And that was all the explanation she gave you? That was all I could sit through. After that, I moved into the guest room and paid no attention to her. She still came home late, and I cooked dinner for myself. When she announced that she was leaving for the weekend, I realized that Providence had intervened. I could pack my things and leave without having to listen to her wailing. I looked at my friend and said, "That was the first good weekend I've had in a month." This elicited a muffled laugh from me, and we ended our evening sipping bourbon and watching people walk by. Day 8, Sunday. Today we had a decision to make. If the wind was strong and from the right direction, we could head for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. If not, we could head to Boston, which is closer. We got up before the sun, checked the weather forecast, made coffee and 2 bowls of cereal, and then decided to hit the road. I had hardly used the engine since that first day, except to get in and out of harbors and through one channel. So unless there was a tailwind, we could reliably make it to the nearest port. As we left Providence Town, the wind died down and we optimistically set a course for Portsmouth. The wind was blowing from the west, and we set the sails at close range, making an acceptable speed on a course 15 degrees west of north. We'd spent so much time the night before discussing my cruise north and personal matters with Sheila that we never had time to discuss the more routine events of the past week. I shook my head, unable to believe what I'd missed in such a short time. Pete had gotten the promotion he'd been hoping for. Jack's oldest daughter was expecting a baby, and Jerry's wife was pregnant with their 3rd child. You can probably tell that it was common interests, not age, that brought us together. Craig and I reminisced about the arrival of our own children and all the changes they brought to our lives. I think we both secretly wished we could do it all over again, but then common sense and nature took over, and we soon came to our senses. Raising children is a young man's game. We were both fast approaching the time when we would become grandparents and were looking forward to it. It was explained to me by my dad, explained to me by his dad, that the primary job of grandparents is to spoil their grandchildren. He and my mom had earned that right, and I eagerly awaited my turn. Damn Sheila and her quest for freedom. That was another thing she ruined. I could still be a grandparent, but living apart, we'd be taking turns sharing the experience at best. The wind had freshened and retreated to the southwest, so we loosened the sheets, hoisted the jib, and sailed a wide course toward Portsmouth. Now we had a great time, and the rest of the day was spent sipping hot coffee and iced tea, practicing knots and telling Dad jokes that would have made our grown children groan. The day was coming when they too would tell Dad jokes and their kids would groan. Yes, the reckoning was coming. As we approached Portsmouth, it was late, but it was not yet night, and we had one more decision to make. We could go up the Piscataqua River, or we could head a little further east and anchor off Shoals Island. It was an easy decision. We had food, we didn't have to fight the current of the river, and if we anchored offshore, we could lay in the cockpit and look at the stars. The little kids in us won out, and we headed for the Shoals Islands. There is limited human access to the Shoals Islands, but we didn't need to go ashore. As the sun went down, it got chilly, so we went downstairs to cook for a while. We had scrambled eggs with canned meat and chili peppers that we pan-fried, and tortillas to make burritos. We brewed coffee to beat the evening chill, and finished the meal with the last cookie I saved in Annapolis before we left. It may not seem like much, but after a day of sun, wind, and sea, it was a real feast. We took a long sail from the Cape. The sun and wind strips one of all cravings and makes one desire something basic, essential, and real. With jackets on, full bellies, and mugs of coffee, we sat in the cockpit and watched the stars slowly spinning overhead. I'm beginning to understand why you went north, Bill. It's really beautiful up here. I only nodded in the darkness. The coast here is rugged and rocky, but there are unlimited navigable rivers and harbors to explore. As we sat there, fish started hitting the surface of the water around the boat. Strippers are chasing bait fish to the surface, said Craig. Either that or a bluefish. I guess it could be a tuna. I've never been much of a fisherman. Maybe that's something I need to look into now that I'm here. Craig took a deep breath. I'm jealous, Bill. I really am. I wonder if I can talk Gloria into moving in. I've been here in the middle of winter. If you try, don't bring her back in January. Summer is great, and the fall colors will take your breath away. But winter is very busy, and spring isn't called mud season for nothing. Now Craig was nodding silently in the dark. I didn't think it was anything more than idle chatter, but 2 years later they moved north. Their kids were grown, and they decided there was more to life than traffic and expensive houses. His co-workers thought they were crazy, and they were not so quietly planning their retirement in South Carolina. South Carolina seemed to be the new Florida. Bill, are you feeling better today? The question caught me off guard, and I had to wonder for a moment what he meant. Yeah, I think I am.
The farther along I get, the better I feel. I turned to look at my friend. Can I tell you something I'm not proud of? Craig only grinned. Sure. I've been thinking a lot about this voyage north and kept coming back to the same question. Which was, why didn't I notice it before? Sheila always wanted more, and she was never satisfied with what we had. I, on the other hand, wanted things that allowed us to do the things we like to do, and I enjoy. She wanted a bigger house and expensive cars so she could impress her friends. Craig interjected. Can I tell you something I'm not proud of? I knew that would make me laugh. Sure. Shaking his head, he said, we've never been impressed with it. And here we were, two grown men sitting in the dark under the stars, drinking coffee and laughing like children. As the wind and cold drove us down, and we closed the hatch, we poured ourselves 2 last cups of coffee and spent another hour passing the guitar back and forth. Neither of us could impress anyone but ourselves with our guitar skills, but it didn't matter. It was the perfect ending to a perfect day, and we were happy. We went to bed and set the alarm for 6. We still had a good swim ahead of us, but it wouldn't be as long as today's if the wind was steady and strong. The last thing I did before turning in was set the GPS alarm in case the anchor didn't hold. We were surrounded by rocks that would be very relentless if we pulled the anchor. Day 9, Monday. The morning alarm clock found us sleeping in, and we were slowly rising. None of us were as young as we used to be, but these few days we were trying our best to appear so. We decided to set off as soon as we got dressed, and then make our morning coffee when we set sail. There are advantages to having a crew on board. The early summer breeze was again fine, and we were sailing at a good pace. We tried to keep a course that allowed us to get 5 to 10 miles offshore as we sailed north and northeast along the main coast. Looking at the pine-covered west coast, I could almost imagine what the first Europeans had seen. But of course my imagination was complete nonsense. When Columbus arrived in the New World, there were already over 60 million natives living on the American continent. That was almost the population of Europe at that time. The coast was dotted with communities and even small towns of natives. A century later, there were only 1/10 as many natives. As I pondered this reality, it seemed to me that my problems paled in comparison. I looked at the horizon as we sailed. There were a few boats out there, but not many, and none approaching us. As I watched them, one by one the towns of York, Ogunquit, Wells, and Kennebunk sailed by. Each passing town brought us closer to Casco Bay and our destination. As we sailed past Cape Elizabeth, it was as if I was walking through the front door of what was once my home. I would cross the threshold, drop my briefcase in the living room, loosen my tie, take a deep breath in and out. Only then did I feel the tension leave me. As I rounded Cape Elizabeth, I felt at home for the first time in 9 days. Casco Bay is unlike any place I've ever sailed. Long slivers of rock aligned in the same direction. It was formed by the last great glacier that passed over this region, leaving a record of its existence in the very rock of the earth. Craig and I found ourselves on the marine playground, playing like 2 kids on the monkey bars in the park. We were making our way between islands, getting here, docking there, and taking the most indirect route to get to the dock where Voyager was waiting. We laughed with every mile, putting out our best, and the boat reacted like the thoroughbred horse it is. It was getting dark by the time we hoisted the sail and tied up to the pier that would become Voyager's new home. Simply put, it was the perfect day and the perfect ending to my trip with good wind, moderate seas, a capable boat, and great company. We stowed all of our stuff downstairs, promising to tidy up the cabin later, closed the hatch, and went in search of dinner. After dinner, we just walked around. Our berth was not in the old port area. I could never afford it. The Voyager was tied up where the city was getting scarcer and more residential, but we found a good place to eat and the walk was pleasant. To my surprise, we passed other people out for an evening walk and struck up conversations with strangers. If everyone here is as friendly as these, I knew I was going to like my new home. Day 10, Tuesday. In the morning, I arranged for the delivery of the rental car. After getting the car, we headed to the old port area to have breakfast and walk around a bit. I needed to walk and stretch my legs. What time is your flight? I haven't booked it yet.
If it's okay with you, I thought I could fly home tomorrow. It doesn't matter when. Yeah, that was fine with me. My solo trip had burned some of the pain out of my soul, and now I was enjoying the company of a good friend who cared about my settling in. So you have to show me your new apartment and your new office. And he was deliberately trying to make me laugh. You're such a girl. Still, it was a good idea. I needed to make sure my new apartment was ready, and it wouldn't hurt to check in at my new office. We crossed the threshold of my apartment. I'd been here once before and knew not to expect much. But the look on Craig's face said he was disappointed. This is temporary until I get my life settled. This is a place to eat, sleep, and store clothes. I don't need much more than that. You took it down with the furniture? I nodded. Yes. There's no room for your office furniture or tools. Yes, I've decided to rent another storage unit until I find a permanent place. He said nothing more. He made his way to the bedroom, looked around and nodded. Without saying anything, he walked around the living room and nodded. Then he made his way to the kitchen. He opened all the cabinets and asked, "Did you bring sheets and a blanket for the bed?" "No." "And towels?" "No." "You're short of pots and pans, and you need a kettle." He looked some more. "You need a good pot so you can make stew while you're at work. Do you have a microwave?" "I don't. We need to get you a microwave. Besides, the curtains in the living room are falling apart." I looked at him and asked, "When did you become Martha Stewart?" He smiled and held out a piece of paper to me. "Gloria gave me a list of things to check out. Also, you'll need a desk and a lamp if you're going to read." I had to admit that when he was right, he was right. Now I had a list of things to do that should keep me busy and out of trouble for a few days. I walked into my future office, said hello to everyone, and told them I'd be at work first thing Monday morning. Craig nudged the guy closest to him and said, "Ask him how he got here." I briefly told them about my journey north and discovered that I would be working with my type of people. There were sailors, fishermen, and everyone skied in the winter. I knew I would fit in when they made me promise that in the future I would tell them more details about my journey and invite everyone to come along for the ride. I never needed a team again, although I still enjoyed going out on my own from time to time. Every tourist and newcomer to Maine is required, if not required by law, to visit the LL store. Being in Freeport, so that was our next destination. We looked at canoes and fancied ourselves, checked out hiking gear and lied, and then I bought some khakis and shirts for work. It was clearly a more casual office than the one I'd left. That night we slept on Voyager for the last time. I knew I'd get cozy in my little apartment, but for now, the cramped quarters of my cutter were home to me. Day 11, Wednesday. We got up, dressed, and ate well after sunrise. Today was truly the end of my journey, and I knew that tonight I would be sleeping in the bed of my new apartment. I would sleep on Voyager again when the urge called me, and spent many weekends exploring the coast. But it was time to start getting back to life on land. I drove Craig to the airport and said goodbye to him, then headed to the store for a table and lamp and bedding. The last thing I did that day was move my stuff, books, and guitar from Voyager to the apartment. I got settled in, and it was no more difficult than that. As I loaded my stuff into the car and prepared to leave for my apartment, I took a long look at Voyager and watched her bobbing and pulling fishing lines. She was looking forward to getting back out to sea, and I knew it wouldn't be long before we were out searching together again. I began my voyage north, hoping to leave the pain of one life behind in search of a new life elsewhere. But somewhere amidst the wind and waves, or maybe huddled together in my cramped quarters, Voyager and I made a connection. With her help, I had been transformed and was now ready to face a new life. Epilogue. The kids called almost every night once they found out I was settled. I talked to them more often after the move than I had before. It seems that when they had time to think about it, they understood my decision. A few weeks after settling in, I flew back to Maryland on Friday night after work and spent the night at a local hotel. Saturday morning, I met my friends for breakfast, and then they helped me load the truck. The truck was small, and we filled it easily. No sooner had I loaded the truck on the trailer than I drove back to my old house. It hadn't been more than a month, but now it seemed like an eternity ago. My journey was complete.
I knocked on the front door, and when Sheila answered, her face reflected surprise, confusion, and condescension. She invited me in, and we sat down in the living room. She had that damn smirk on her face, so I let her begin. "So, are you finally done with your little fight and ready to get back to marriage?" And I could relate to her better if she said something else. "No, I'm not going back." Her smirk disappeared and she just stared at me. It's funny how someone who betrayed you can continue to think they're irreplaceable in your life, as if you could never do without them. I have a new life now and I'm not going back. You've made your decision, and I've made mine. The best thing you can do is just sign the papers, and we can both move on with our lives. She tried to negotiate, pleaded, offered just about everything but George, but there was no turning back. A man hopes his wife will love him, but even more he needs her to respect him. Sheila didn't respect me. Somewhere along the way I'd lost her respect if I had any, and there was no point in guessing where. Soon I was driving the truck and trailer north, following the path I'd taken not too many weeks before. It's funny how at the time my preparations for the move had seemed daunting, but now somehow my old life fit easily into a small truck with my books and tools in the back and guitars in the cab beside me. As then I spent the night alone in some distance north of New York City, and in the morning I made my second solo trip north. This time I was returning to my life rather than searching for it, and I knew that no matter what I would enjoy the years ahead. I did find love the second time around, and I have friends, both old and new, with whom I shared the journey. But that's a story for another time. As for Sheila and George, sometimes I fantasized about revenge, but I realized it was just pain and anger. I tried to replace the pain with joy, the isolation with socializing with good friends. And soon Sheila was just another random problem, and George didn't matter at all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.